morning. I acknowledge the traditional territory of the Nanaimo people and thank them for their continuing welcome and stewardship of the land. Reconciliation. When I was a young lawyer, this was called the land question. I first heard the land question in 1977. I was a lawyer working for the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs on the West Coast Oil Ports Inquiry. The late Godfrey Kelly of Haida Gwaii, he was on a panel of expert Aboriginal people talking about the impact of oil spills to their fish-dependent culture. And then I heard the land question. He said it quite politely. I heard it a number of ways. He said, "Where's the government's bill of sale?" And then I heard him say, "Where did the government get the authority to put our fish at risk when the Haida never surrendered our land?" And it was a question waiting to find me. I grew up Jewish, a post-Holocaust kid, and I was fixed with the question, how could all this murder be done under cover of law? So I went to law school, and then I thought, well, if murder could be done under cover of law, so could theft. And that is the question I've had the privilege of litigating all of my life for 4 decades. I stumbled on my life's work then and there. I've practiced law in an all-women's law firm, Mandell Pinder, and as women, we did things differently than men. The law is often too technical and rule-bound to understand relationships. So we relied on intuition, knowing and not knowing. My dear friends for decades, I honor these women, and I also honor the people I worked for. The law, which was binding the Crown when they asserted sovereignty, was that they were to respect the laws and land of the Indigenous people with the incremental perfection of Crown sovereignty through treaty. But that didn't happen in British Columbia. In British Columbia, they just stole the land fair and square. In spite of the law that vilified their culture, outlawed the potlatch, sent the kids to residential school, made it illegal for Indigenous people to hire lawyers to fight the land question, they kept alive a dream of justice. And it was this beautiful dream of justice that found me. My work has been a love story. I've been working for matrilineal cultures. I've spent my life work in the company of people who love me and who I love, and whose love of the land is so beautiful, passing down stories of their relationships and their naming every bay and inlet and every river and mountaintop, and every plant on the forest floor has a cultural name and story. And so over these years, I've had a glimpse of a beautiful legal order that involves the creator and supernaturals and spirit healers and spirit helpers and ancestors and all living things, all interconnected, including us humans. And so when I began working for the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en, they said, okay, we're going to put all of that before the court. We're prepared to tell the court how we got title. And they did. They put into evidence their oral histories and their crests and their songs, their totem poles, and all of what made their relationship to the land powerful over the millennium. But they said, okay, so you asked the Crown, how did they get title? And so the Crown responded. The Crown gave voice through their defenses of extinguishment to the founding myths of this country, a superior race of people who brought the benefits of democracy and Christianity and capitalism to less evolved people to promote their evolution. These myths crystallized into legal doctrines, the doctrine of discovery, which was based on the false superiority of Crown governments, and the doctrine of terra nullius, which was based on the false inferiority of Indigenous governments. And so I litigated the fiction of an Indian race, and I litigated stereotypes. And the Holocaust, it didn't begin in the gas chambers. It began with stereotyping of people, sending people as the other into cattle cars to their slaughter. And so with Indigenous people, the stereotyping was of savage Indians, people who didn't have any laws. And then the poverty stereotyping. You're responsible for your own poverty, an epidemic of individual failures. Why have kids? You can't take care of them. Shaming discourse, shaming and then silence. Well, welcome to the change. It's time for change. The paradigm has shifted. The Supreme Court of Canada in Delgamuukw said Aboriginal title has not been extinguished in British Columbia. It has a jurisdictional and an economic component. In the Chilcotin case, the court said that consent is the pathway to certainty. So we have the court saying we live in a legally pluralistic society, 2 legal orders on the ground, both having title, both with jurisdiction. Now the task is to create mechanisms for sharing decision-making and revenue and benefit sharing. Internationally, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a human rights framework resting on principles such as free, prior, and informed consent. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, intergenerational cascade of trauma, produced key recommendations as the path to addressing our unprecedented challenge of healing the wounds from the past. The Liberal Party swept into power, saying it would enact the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, including implementation of the UN Declaration. So this is our lives, changing ourselves, changing our society. We've come to do this work. Changing collectively, it's not an option. We have treated the earth as if keeping our species alive is a guarantee. But the earth is speaking its symptoms to us. We must now learn to cooperate with a different collective mindset, or we're going to destroy the life support systems which make it possible for us to live here as humans. Well, we can't change the past, but we can change the future by the stories we tell. And we can tell a different story. We're reimagining ourselves. We're shifting to a new story of our unity and our diversity. We're all connected. We're all interconnected. Interconnected creates compassion. And compassion is medicine. Through compassion, we can destroy the prejudices which cause separation. We can move to a place where we recognize our shared humanity, and everyone is part of it. So here is my ask for you. I ask you to don't wait for government. We are all guests here on Mother Earth, and we're all guests in the lands, ancestral lands of Indigenous people. In your personal and your professional lives, form relationships with the Indigenous people in whose territories you live and work. Create partnerships. Accommodation is a gratifying choice. And listen to your new friends. An elder said that being heard is so close to being loved, it's almost indistinguishable. The Dalai Lama said that compassion and love are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity just can't simply survive. And practice compassion on yourself. And I'd like to tell you this story. My father passed away, and when he did, we cleaned out his house, and we found my grandparents' immigration papers. And Indigenous people always say, never forget where you come from, but I never knew where I came from. So as soon as we saw that, we headed out to the Ukraine, where my mother and father's mom and dad lived in this small town, so small that there's still roosters on the street. And we learned there that the story of the Jewish people was that those that were there during the war all were rounded up in one day and they were all murdered. And there was no graves, all the graves were just flattened. And that took us to the nearest town of Lvov, which we had the just accidental good fortune to have lunch with the rabbi of Lvov. This was a community of 30,000 Jewish people before the war, now under 100. And at lunch, I asked him the question. I said, my grandparents got out in 1906. I said, and his did too. And I said, why do you think they left? I mean, when you go to that place, you could hardly imagine Canada. And he doesn't miss a beat, and he talks about pogroms, and he says that when you are functioning as peoples under the rule, without reference to the rule of law, where people can just come and kill you or take away, shame you or take away your possessions, where going to the police, he said, would just make matters worse. He said, you're prepared to give it all up to get anything different. And when he spoke, I felt my body in trauma and realized that I quickly thought of the Aboriginal murdered and missing women, where going to the police wouldn't have made it worse, but it didn't make it any better. And then the kids in care and what got them there, and my clients living under the radar of the rule of law for all this century. And I realized that I've been contributing to a process of reconciliation and healing as a way of coping with the consequences of this great catastrophe. That trauma passes in our DNA, our biology becomes our biography. But the pure beauty of it all is I realized that in my clients loving me, I had transmuted some of that fear and some of that shame, and I had actually grown to be able to see my own way through to self-compassion. And if you can create an inner environment where your mistakes are forgiven, candidly confronted, your resilience expands exponentially. So on the way to the airport, we were late. The cab didn't come. I was nervous. Forget about all my new realizations. I was just in a state of late, late, late. And we get to the counter, and the woman says, "I'm sorry you're late. We're closed. You can't get in." And I really was just so emotional, I started to cry. And at that moment, she said, "Oh, but we can get you on the 11 o'clock flight." And just in 1 minute, I went from being late to being early. And it was just awesome. I felt expansive. I could get a cup of coffee. I could buy a book. It was a beautiful moment. And I realized that it's time to change. We can shift on a dime. The Creator put us in the world of the possible, not the impossible. Thank you very much.